So now we're going to trace this block pattern that we created using the tracing paper that we talked about in our Know Your Tools portion. And we're going to use our pattern weights to sort of blot everything down so that nothing shifts as we're doing our tracing. And these come in handy for cutting as well as tracing. Okay, we're going to grab ourselves a pencil and also just keep our rulers nearby just in case we need to reinforce some of those lines with our rulers. And I'm just going to go in and trace some of the key areas. So I'm going to trace, actually I'm going to use my ruler because I'm going to go in and first get that shoulder seam. Okay, I'll go in all the ones that I can use a straight line with, so I'm going to get those darts. These are all the ones where I can clearly see where the lines are going to be nice and easy for me. I'm going to have to probably whip out my French curve in order to finish some of those curves. So this is our center front. I'm going to show you all the markings for that very shortly. I'm also going to get my side seam here. Go. All right, I think that's fairly good. So I can now go in and use my curve to get my waist area. Go on this side, move that a little bit over. Okay, I'm gonna put that back there. So now I'm gonna go in and get that neckline. Although we're not gonna use it, as you'll see, it's very useful to just trace out the entire, especially when you're fairly new to pattern making. And even if you're not new, you wanna make sure all your measurements are accurate and you have symmetry, so you don't want to go ahead and cut anything out just yet until you're sure you have all your measurements accurate. So I'm just going to go in, even though a lot of these I won't use, because as we'll see, the style of garment we're choosing to make, you don't necessarily need some of these lines. But we're going to go ahead and put them in there anyway, just for the sake of this. So if you can see it now, we just have our basic block pattern. So what do we need to do next? So we can refer back to our initial sketch and just sort of look at some of those key things. So looking at our initial sketch, what does that look like? Okay, well, this looks like a sweetheart bodice, so it looks like there is no top part. So where we have the neckline drawn here and the armholes, that's not gonna, it's gonna be necessary because this is all gonna be gone. So we want to focus on creating this sweetheart neckline appearance, but we will need to keep the darts because that is still a key part of our design. So we're gonna go in. How do we create that? So first I'm going to make sure that I note that this is my center front. So this is the front of my dress. So I want to make sure, we usually just write CF or center front. And that's just letting you know that this portion right here is going to sit in the front of the garment. And because the garment is going to be cut on the fold, you're also going to need to indicate that as well. So when we're laying out our pattern on fabric, you want to have as many notations as possible on the pattern so that when you're cutting, you don't sort of get distracted and say, oh, I was supposed to cut 2, but I only cut 1, because that tends to drive you crazy. So you want to put as much notation on the actual pattern as possible. Okay. So that's going to be our center front. So from that center front point, I'm going to use some different colors here. Center front, I'm going to come down. So this is from the neck. I'm going to come down to about 5 inches. I'm just going to mark that there for myself. And I'm going to show you how we're going to create that sweetheart neckline. Then I'm going to go to my armhole area and I'm going to drop it to about 1/2 inch. Or let me say 5/8. I'm just gonna make that line right there. So let's see would be the best method. So if I use my hip ruler, it wouldn't, if I'm trying to create that sweetheart arch, I'm not gonna get that much of an arch, and it really depends on what kind of arch you're looking for. I want a more dramatic arch, so I'm gonna use my French curve because that's gonna give me a much more dramatic arch that I'm looking for. So I'm gonna start right here. And I'm just going to lightly from that 5-inch point, just start to create that sweetheart neckline. Okay, so we ended up going a little bit further down, and that's fine. Because at the end of the day, you want to make sure, these are just guidelines, but you want to make sure, the key thing is making sure you get that actual sweetheart point. And again, when you're using this, especially the tracing paper, it can be used as a tissue fitting. So you don't, if you decide, oh, that actually needs to go up a little bit higher, you have the range there. You can always glue that area of seam allowance back on. Okay, so it's a fairly simple line. So now we need to make sure that we add seam allowance. What is seam allowance for? Well, it's exactly what it means, is allowing fabric availability for a seam to be done. So if I'm going to sew on this seam, the excess that I add here is going to be the seam allowance, and that's just obviously so that the stitches have something to hold on to and that you're not, you know, using the exact edge. In the higher end garments, you'll notice that there's less seam allowance, and that's something that has to do with high fashion garments. It's far less. In the more mass-produced pieces, there's a little bit more seam allowance, and that's often there because they want to make space for alteration. So in a lot of the special occasions dresses I do, I'll see an average of 1 to 2 inches seam allowance, and that's just there for me to let out a garment if need be. But mostly on your store-bought patterns, the average seam allowance is about 5/8. So we're going to use that as a guide. So I'm going to use my ruler, and I'm just going to mark using, let's see, let's use a different color here. Let me go in and use this blue. Actually, no, we can go ahead with the pink. So I'm going to use this to mark my seam allowance. So this is my line. I'm just going to go 5/8, and I'm going to follow that curve. So I'm just going to stay on that line and follow that curve. But because we want it to be nice and even, we're just going to cross that out. So now you can already start to see that sweetheart shape here, and we can already see what it looks like. If you wanted to, just so you knew to cut, you can draw like a pair of scissors, and that's what you often see in store-bought patterns. They have the scissors to let you know to cut. And you'll want to make as many markings as possible, because as you're cutting out a garment, you'll realize there's a lot of moving parts to these things, and you want to make it as easy as possible so that you really don't have to think too much. You're just reading and doing what you're supposed to do with the reading. Okay, so let's do some other marking. So I already said the dress is going to be cut on the fold. So what we do is we create these marks to indicate that when we are cutting, the fabric should be folded, and then this should be placed on the very edge. If you move, there's no seam allowance here. This is not like the center back where we're going to have that 5/8 seam allowance or that 1 inch seam allowance to make room for a seam and a zipper. You don't have that unless it's a part of the design, and this is not part of our design. So you want to make sure the fabric is going to be on the fold, and that's an indication you want to make. So we're going to put cut on fold, and that's just for you to know this is going to be cut on the fold. So what's our next marking? So again, we want to make sure we add seam allowance to our garment. So I said 5/8 here. Just gonna do it this way. We're gonna start down here, about 5/8. And that's just giving us some breathing room in case we need to make any adjustments. And we'll do it all around because this dress is going to be attached at the waist, so it's not going to be all one piece, so it's going to be attached at the waist. Start here first. You might be wondering why I haven't added seam allowance to this just yet, because I'm going to leave it open for right now, and then we're going to actually just fold this over. If it turns out that you can also actually go in and do like a 1/2 inch seam allowance. You can go in and say, okay, I'm going to mark this. But because we actually haven't fit this yet, I'm just going to leave this as is and cut around it and just make sure I have my marking so that I know I'm going to fold this over. So I'm just going to write that. Fold over. And then I'm going to have, anytime you're closing up a dart, it should always be in the direction of the center front or center back. And that's both in the skirt and in the bodice. So I'm going to be folding in this direction because that is the direction of the center front. Remember, CF, center front. Okay, so now we have our side seam. And I like to make these notations here, these slashes, and these are slashes that you're going to transfer over to your actual garment. And this just lets you know this is a side seam. So when you're doing your back bodice, you're going to make sure you do the same slashes because you're going to use those as a guide to match them as you're putting the garment together, both in the muslin mock-up and the actual dress itself. You're going to use all these as markings. Now, if this was like a full scale bodice and we weren't cutting off that portion, there will also be another mark right here. And this is an indication that you are dealing with the front. You might be like, well, I obviously know I'm dealing with the front, but the front and back look very similar. And in certain designs, they look so similar that you'll forget. And if you don't know where the front and back is, it's going to make it difficult if you're putting sleeves on, and it's just going to make it difficult for the overall garment. So as tedious as it seems to make these markings, it's important because it makes sure that the garment is more accurate and that you don't spend so much time constantly trying to figure out, okay, why does this just look really off? So your markings are extremely important to your garment making. So when we're talking about markings, there's some other things we also want to mark. So when I'm marking my garment, I know that I'm going to be having some additional things. So it's not just going to be the main fabric. I know I'm going to have interfacing like we discussed. And I know I'm also going to have a lining and possibly boning. I don't make my boning marks here, but I definitely like to note, one, that I'm going to have to cut at least one of these on the fold for interfacing, so I need to mark that. I'm also going to have to cut one on the fold of lining. I'm going to make all these markings. Why? Because as I said, when you are creating the garment, you want to make sure that you are giving as much detail and as many notes here, and it's going to help you so that you're not trying to like figure it out as you're going along. You want to give yourself as much a guide as possible to your design. Okay, so we basically got all that we need. And what's the last step? Well, basically, we're going to use these indicators and we're going to cut. And once we're done cutting, we're going to place it on our mannequin to see if we did a good job in creating our block. So I'm going to go in on 1 second because when you're doing the dart, you want to make sure that they're at a curve. If not, you're going to have a hard time holding it. So even though I'm not ready to cut those open just yet, I want to make sure I have that point there to let me know that's how I'm going to cut. Okay, so let's go in and cut. Okay, with that part, I'm gonna move this a little bit and get our center front. All right, we're gonna put that over to the side. I'm gonna go in and just fold my dart over. And that's already a good indicator, and the way this is matching up is already letting me know that I'm in the right direction. I'm just going to use pins to close this up and not actual glue. Once you're sure about it, once you've done your tissue fitting on the garment and you're pretty sure about it, you can use glue, but just understand you're going to have to open this back up once you move it to your actual dress form. So just for the sake of the video, I'm just going to fold it up, and then when I'm placing it on the mannequin, I'm just going to use pins. So we can already see sort of the sweetheart coming down like this. So let's take it to the mannequin and see what we did. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe. Videos are uploaded weekly covering dressmaking, fashion, lectures, and more.